When I think about Tuscumbia, I think about a place to where you can come, you can bring what you already have, you can use that, you can use it well for the glory of the Lord. Not only that, but you can create more talents for yourself. And so if you are looking for a church home this morning, we want to encourage you to look at Tuscumbia, to look at this place, this body of believers here in this place. Consider us. And I promise you that this is a place that will use the talents that you have and that we will make them any better. What a blessing it is this morning to find out that the Kinnemer family is going to be numbered with us, and they have many talents that all of us are going to help them use, and many talents that we're going to help them find even more of. And so very thankful for that great news this morning. I was talking with a friend one time, and as we were talking, this friend asked me, said, "Do you know why God chose the very last day of creation to create man?" And I thought I knew. I thought it was, He saved the best for last. And they said, no, it wasn't because of that. The reason God waited to the very last day to create man was because if He had created him first, man would have been trying to tell God how to create the rest of the world. He basically would have been arguing with God and saying, hey, I know a better way than you know. And really, if you think about it, that's something that man has been doing since the beginning of time. We have found ways to argue with God and to try to change the way God has planned something to make it fit our lives a little bit better. Going back to the Garden of Eden, here's a perfect, beautiful place that God has created for Adam and Eve to live, as far as we know, forever. At this point, they couldn't get sick, they couldn't die. Nothing could be better. But as far as we know, there was one rule recorded in the Bible: don't eat of this tree, don't do it. But we know the mistake was made, and it was because they chose to basically argue with God. They thought that their way was going to be just a little bit better than God's way. I think about the children of Israel as they are being led to the promised land. They are leaving Egypt. God has done some pretty amazing things up to this point to help lead them to where they are, and as they are traveling, they're complaining a little bit already before they even cross the Red Sea, and then God performs a wonderful miracle. They cross the Red Sea on dry land. They continue going through this wilderness, trying to get to the promised land, and what do? They murmur, they complain the entire time. God, your way's not best. Maybe we should have stayed in Egypt to where we would be slaves the rest of our lives. I know that you led us this far. I know you've done amazing signs and wonders, showing us the 10 plagues, letting us go across the Red Sea on dry land. But really, God, we're human. We have a brain. We can think, and really looking at your way, we feel like that your way isn't quite as good as where we were before. We could go through endless stories throughout our Bible of when people complained about God's way. People argued with God. I think that arguing is something that we all kind of want to do a little bit anyway, and especially win arguments. Whenever we have an argument, don't we want to win that argument? We do. It's funny how you remember things like this, but I remember things like this. Betsy and I had been dating for about 7 months, and I was very proud of myself because I thought, all right, I've been dating this girl for 7 months, and we haven't even had an argument yet. And we really hadn't. We really hadn't. We had been dating for 7 months, and I thought, I've got this thing figured out, and I think we can make this relationship work, and maybe this is a girl I could one day marry, especially if we never have an argument. But I remember the day, the place, the why. We had our very first argument, It was October 30th, 2004, if you really want to know the date. It was late in the evening. I am a big Auburn fan. My wife is not. She pulls for the opposite of Auburn, the Crimson team. She loves them, and I soon found out on October 30th, 2004, that she wasn't one of those girls that just liked Alabama because of the colors. She really liked the team. And so I was a freshman in college, and Auburn had a good season. They went undefeated that season, and I'd gone to every game up to that point, home and away, and I was excited. But that weekend, I decided to stay home. Auburn was playing at Ole Miss, and I said, I'll stay at home and I'll watch this game with my girlfriend. And so we watched the game, and she watched her game as Alabama played, and one thing led to another, and we started talking football, and she didn't realize how much I really loved Auburn, and I didn't really know how much she loved Alabama, and we said a few things we shouldn't have said, and it caused our first really, really big argument. I remember that. I would like to say that we have never argued about football since, but we have. And there are arguments far more important, obviously, but that was the first argument we ever had. We argue with each other. It's a common thing. But why do we argue with God? Why do we argue with the person who created us, who created a plan to save us? Let's look at a few examples from the Bible, and then we're going to try to relate these to our own lives. Leviticus chapter 10 is where we're going to spend these first few minutes. We don't spend too much time very often in the book of Leviticus, but it's got some very good things, practical things for our lives today. Two men named Nadab and Abihu. These were priests of God. They were the sons of the high priest, Aaron. And Nadab and Abihu thought that they could argue with God and win. They thought that they could change something God had already said, and that it would be okay. Starting in Leviticus chapter 10, verse 1, Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu took their censers, put fire in them, and added incense, and they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord contrary to His command. So their job is to offer up a certain kind of fire in a certain way up to the Lord. And obviously here they offer up what the Bible refers to as strange fire to the Lord, fire that was unauthorized by God. And so we look at this and we think, this is something simple. Maybe they just change one little thing. They change up the fire just a little bit in the way that they are going to offer something up to God. But in verse 2, we see the consequences of their mistake. So fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. It's never a good idea to argue with a command that God gave. It doesn't matter how little the command seems. It doesn't matter how big the command seems. When we tell God that we know a better way, we're making a really big mistake and heading down a road that we shouldn't go down. Joshua and Caleb. Look at Numbers chapter 13. Numbers chapter 13. As we mentioned earlier, God had this great plan to rescue the children of Israel. They had been slaves for several hundred years, and He was working His plan, and He had worked His plan perfectly all the way through, despite the murmuring and complaining and the folks wanting to go back and change their minds. And so finally, they get to the promised land. Here they are. Now, when we look at this, they should have already had enough trust in God's promises to really not even ask that spies go into the land and search it out and look and see how hard it was going to be to overcome. Because if they had enough trust in God, it didn't matter if the people they were going to be fighting were giants or if they were the ones that looked like grasshoppers. Because when God is on your side, it doesn't matter. When God is on your side, you know that you are going to be victorious. But still, God allows them to send 12 spies in and kind of scope out the land a little bit. And as they're looking through the land, these 12 spies, let's begin in verse 27 of Numbers chapter 13. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. So right here, they are basically saying that, okay, God, we have gone into this land. You have promised us that it is a land flowing with milk and honey, and we see that. It is indeed a land flowing with milk and honey, a land that we can live in and basically have everything that we ever wanted. But then, in verse 28, but the people who live there are powerful. What does that matter? If God is more powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. Later on it says that we look like grasshoppers, they look like giants. And so because of this decision of the 10 spies, 10 were bad, 2 were good, Joshua and Caleb, because of this decision, they had to wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. And those who rebelled against the promises of God never got to see the promised land. God made a promise. And He proved over and over that when I make a promise, I keep my promises. But in this instance, they didn't trust God. They chose instead, I'm going to argue a little bit with God. I think that my way is a little bit better than what you have planned. Moving on, 1 Samuel chapter 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15. Saul is the king. He is the first king. Samuel was the last judge. Let's see, 1 Samuel chapter 15. And as we look here, Samuel has kind of been told by God to go and talk to Saul and tell Saul, all right, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go and completely destroy all of the Amalekites. This was a powerful group of folks, and God wanted those folks to be destroyed and all of their possessions to be destroyed. So Saul got his troops together. They went to do just that, and that's what he thought that he did. But he didn't quite do it completely as God had said. He let the king live, and he saved some of the best of their, animals to make a sacrifice to God. And he thought, okay, I did everything God said. I'm going to do even better than what God said. I'm going to save some of the animals, even though God told me to destroy everything. And I'm going to sacrifice these up to God. So God will actually end up being even happier with me than before. Let's look at, starting in verse 20. Before we do, though, Samuel comes a little bit later, and he comes to check in on Saul. And Saul's happy. He's looking and he's thinking about what he has just accomplished. He says, I did everything God said. Samuel said, well, what's that sound that I hear? Why do I hear the bleating of sheep? Why do I hear these animals moving around if you did what God said? He said, well, I may have saved a few of them. But I did it for good reasons. And so back to 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 20. But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. So he's happy. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was destroyed to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. But Samuel replied, Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? What does God care more about? When we obey Him, or when we do most of what He says and we're offering sacrifices and we're trying to do what's right, but we're not fully obeying Him? Let's read this again, verse 22. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. It's important to obey God. And King Saul saw this because it was at this point to where he made this mistake, and then David was anointed to be the next king. And he ended up losing that responsibility of being king because of that. Let's look at one more example. There's a man named Uzzah that we read about in our Old Testament as well. As the children of Israel, as David is bringing the Ark of the Covenant, he's wanting to bring it back. It's been gone for many years, and he's wanting to bring it back to Jerusalem. And they load up the Ark on a cart, and here is Uzzah. He is walking beside the cart, and the oxen's foot kind of stumbles a little bit, and the cart starts to tip over, and he reaches up to catch the Ark, naturally probably. But for that split second, he forgot that only the Levites, only the priests, were allowed to touch the Ark. And so he fell over and he died because of this. Do we feel like that these cases are a little harsh? You know, Saul was trying to do something good. Sure, he disobeyed God, but he was trying to do something. Uzzah was trying to do something good. He was trying to keep the ark from falling and breaking, maybe. Was the punishment a little bit harsh? Are we going to tell God how to run His business? These stories that are in our Bible were given to us for a specific purpose. And I believe that purpose is to teach us that it doesn't matter how silly it sounds, how small it seems, we can't argue with God. He has put things in place for a certain reason. And we do not have the right to go against what God has ordained. We simply cannot afford to argue with God. So what does this have to do with us today? How can we relate this to our lives? Is this something that is still seen today in the church? People who profess to be Christians around the world? Are there folks who still try to argue with what God has commanded? I think so. Actually, I know so. Is baptism really necessary? We can look at multiple examples throughout the New Testament of folks being saved, and we really can't find an example of someone becoming a Christian without baptism. But there's people out in the world, believe it or not, who think that we don't have to be baptized. It's something that we're saved long before baptism. You know, that's not what God says. But baptism seems silly. It seems silly to go and get wet when I already know that I love Jesus, and I don't have to be baptized to show that I love Jesus. We do, because God says it. As silly as it might sound, God says it, and we don't have the right to argue with God. Just like Nadab and Abihu offered up strange fire. It was something small, but it was something big in the eyes of God. What about the belief that once we're saved, we're always saved? Once we put on Christ, that there's nothing we can do to fall away from that. That's not what the Bible teaches. We look at multiple scriptures, and the Bible teaches us that we have to continue the race until the day of our death to make sure that we have won a crown of life. Well, but God, when He wrote that, He didn't really understand how difficult it was going to be in the world, how difficult it was going to be for us to live. He did, and He made the rule anyway. How about those who teach that there are many ways? There are many ways to get to heaven. There's not just one way. And when God said that I am the way, and when Jesus is the only way, He didn't really mean that. He didn't know how big the world was going to get, and that there were going to be 7 billion plus people in the world, and that really there were going to be so many different views, and there are going to be many ways to get to heaven. There's one way. There's one way. Because God says there's one way. Homosexuality. We live in a culture today that is becoming more acceptable of this sin that is so clearly stated throughout Scripture. Well, things change. When that was written, it wasn't as accepted as it is today, and if we want to, we can't accept it. God says not to accept it. Why are we going to chance arguing with God? Appointing elders. Well, we really don't have to listen to all the rules that the Bible says about appointing elders. Nobody's perfect. Let's just put some men in place and see what happens. Sure, they may not be qualified, but God doesn't understand how difficult it is to find godly elders this way. The Bible shows us how to appoint godly elders. Same thing for godly deacons. Women's role in the church. We live in a society to where women have a lot more rights than they've ever had in their life. And I think that is a very good thing. But there are restrictions. There are things that women are not supposed to do in the church. And a lot of folks believe that if you stand up and you say that here is something that a woman is not supposed to do, that you are saying something that shouldn't be said. Women have a role in the church. Men have a role in the church. God has showed us what that role is. Who are we to change what He said? What about abortion? Is that something we can kind of waver a little bit with in our ideas, in our thoughts? Did God really mean, not to murder? Was He talking about small children? God says it. We can't argue with that. What about sex before marriage? Something that is commonly accepted in society today. We see it on almost any TV show we turn on. It's accepted. If you're not having sex before marriage, you're not cool. You're not hip. You're not like everybody else. You're an outcast. And I know the Bible says to save yourself for marriage, but you know what? I think I have a better way. God didn't know how hard it would be just to say no. God didn't know how difficult it would be to go home and watch a movie with our parents instead of going out parking in a car when He wrote this. God did know, and He made the rule anyway. Who are we to argue with the commands of God? Well, what about gossip? Surely God didn't mean I can't talk about, say bad things about people. He doesn't know the kind of job that I work in, and all the people that I work with, my co-workers, they're saying bad things and they're spreading rumors. Surely He didn't mean for me to always keep my mouth shut, to always say positive things, to always try to build people up. Surely not, but surely yes. Why do we continue to argue with God, saying our way is better than your way? Well, what about worrying? What about worrying? Do we have any worry warts? Surely God didn't mean for me not to worry when He says not to worry. He does. It's difficult, but He says it. Well, sure, God tells me to bring up my children in a correct way, bring up my children in a way to where they are going to honor and love the Lord, but children nowadays, and boys will be boys, and so, this world is just so hard, and I just can't bring a godly family up. You can't. And we have to. The list goes on and on and on and on. Forsaking the assembly. We're all here this morning, obviously. Will we stay for Bible class? Will we come back tonight? Will we be here on Wednesday night? Will we try to make the picnic? Will we try to make the fish fry? Will we try to do this and that and everything? Surely God didn't mean for me to always be a part of the assembly. Doesn't He know that I'm really tired when I get home from work? And surely He understands this time of year I stay up a little later than usual watching football, and I'm not really myself on Sunday mornings, and so I may miss a few times. Surely God says it. We don't have the right to argue with that. Dressing modestly. Not being content with what we have. Cursing. Surely God doesn't want us to get out all of the cuss words that we say. Alcohol. Harming our body in various ways. Having other things that come before us and God. Not giving thanks. Not using our talents. Lying, lusting, complaining. We're told to pray without ceasing. Surely we don't have to pray all the time. Well, pray as often as we can. Search the Scriptures daily. Obeying our parents. Children, are we doing that? God doesn't know how my parents are. They make rules that nobody else has in their house. Do I really have to obey my parents? I'm afraid so. Not because I say so, but because God says so. And who am I to argue with God? They're really, we could stand here all day and try to number the different ways that we can argue with God. And there are so many. And basically, whenever we say that we think that we know a way that's better than your way, it's arguing with God. And I know that we, as humans, like to argue at times, and we definitely like to win arguments. But let's not argue with God, because He knows what's best. He's proven it time and time again. His promises are sure. He is yet to break a promise that He's made. As far as we can tell, God doesn't punish the way that He punished in some of these stories that we talked about at the beginning. Aren't you glad that every time you make a mistake, God doesn't just strike you down dead? I'm glad that He gives second, third, fourth, 1,000th opportunity to me, to you, to everyone. In some ways it might be better at times, if people were falling over dead every time they sinned. I think there would be a lot less sin in the world, but still, we all sin. There would be nobody left in the world if that were the case. We don't want to be guilty of arguing with the one who made us and trying to make it look like we know a better way. If you're here this morning and you are living a life to where you're in a constant conflict, a constant battle with God, we need to change that. You need to change that in your life this morning. And just say, I give up. I give up. You win, God. You win the argument. Isn't that the best way to end any argument with anyone? Just to surrender and say, you win? A lot of times. But that's how we need to treat God. God wins the argument whether we think we won or not. And so let's go ahead and let Him have that victory. Let's turn our lives over to Him. If you're here this morning and you have not put on Christ in baptism, believing that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, leaving your past sins, confessing Him before others, why would you wait any longer than this morning to be baptized and to not argue with God anymore and say, all right, I don't know why this is exactly why you want me to do this, but the fact is you want me to do this, and I have to do this in order to go to heaven. Why put it off any longer? Or if we are constantly in a battle with God, and there are things in our life that needs to be changed, let's change that today. As together we stand and sing.